Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen. I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. The Mexican elections pose a major challenge this year. And that's why in the run-up to the vote on July 1st, we're doing a series of programs to look at precisely that issue. Today, we're very happy to be joined by a prominent Mexican elections expert, the author and the journalist Eduardo Huchim. Eduardo has been following the role of the elections authorities and also an issue that's fundamental in today's elections but has received less attention, campaign financing. Eduardo, thank you so much for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
I'm delighted to be here, Laura.
I wanted to start off, you form part of a network of intellectuals that has appealed to the elections authorities to guarantee free and fair elections in the July 1st, 2018 vote here. Is there a special concern regarding these elections?
I think that these elections are kind of a special case because after what they call the alternation of power, when a different party won the presidency, the old party has come back. The Revolutionary Institutional Party, the PRI, which had held the presidency for 70 years. And the return of that party has been very, very bad for the country. Because Enrique Peña Nieto's government has been characterized by corruption. Corruption in every part of the government, every order of politics and the economy. They are also subduing the country with a bloody wave of violence and chaos through a mistaken policy on organized crime, especially with regard to drug trafficking. A policy based on bloody repression of drug trafficking, while a successful policy will need to go another way. Peña Nieto's government has carried out this policy because of the demands of the United States that his battle take place in Mexico's ground. This battle has cost a huge amount of Mexican lives, especially of young people, whichever side they're on, whichever side of the desk they're on. The truth is, there is a terrible cost in blood. But it's something that has a lot of opposition among Mexican society because it's being done at the request of our neighbor to the north, to please our neighbor to the north. And Laura, there is a tragic irony because nowadays Mexico exports substances to the United States, mainly marijuana, so that the American people can have fun. Then the United States sends guns to Mexico so that we kill each other. It's a tragedy and an irony. And this is the environment in which this election is happening. And in this election, there is a candidate running for the third time, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and for the very first time, he really has a solid chance of winning. That's what all the polls show. But he's confronting the whole force of the Mexican state, of the government and its party, who are working on what we call here vote buying and voting coercion. to buy votes and to cheat in the election in 1,000 of different ways. Like, for example, you can see this unfair situation in the fact that there's a candidate on the ballot who shouldn't be in there. His name is Jaime Rodriguez,
I want to get to that
aka El Bronco, but we'll talk about him later. But the opposition candidate, both Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Ricardo Anaya, are not competing against a political party, the PRI, or not only against the political party, but against the entire force of Mexican state, placed at the service of the PRI candidate, José Antonio Meade. That's an element that distorts and slows down the advance of Mexican democracy.
It's an extremely complicated scenario that we have here then. We have corruption, we have violence, we have interests of the United States to maintain a security model that the majority of the population is now rejecting. And we have a number of irregularities and violations in the past that we've seen. Let's talk a little about the case that you mentioned of Jaime Rodriguez, El Bronco. In this case, he was originally rejected from the ballot as an independent candidate because of invalid signatures, and now suddenly he's a candidate. What happened there, and what does it tell us about the elections?
It's a big issue. Jaime Rodriguez El Bronco. I argued that when he announced that he wanted to run for president, that the first thing that he needed to do was to resign the governorship of Nuevo León. Because what could happen, I said, is that certain elements in the Nuevo León government, with human and financial resources, could be drafted into service to advance the presidential aspirations of the state's government. Unfortunately, he didn't resign. El Bronco announced that he wanted to be president and started looking for support. And he kept being governor of Nuevo León. Eventually, he had to ask for a leave of absence to resign temporarily for the Nuevo León governorship, but he really should have had to resign, leave office definitively, not just temporarily.
By law?
Yes, so still governor, although a governor on leave. Well, in that situation, he started collecting signatures to support his candidacy. But it's more than a signature. It's a signature and also the information from the voter identification card, so that he could gather a certain number of signatures and present them to the electoral authority to demonstrate that he had the grassroots support he needs to register as a presidential candidate. The process of gathering signatures took place, in the case of El Bronco, in an environment where there were a lot of dirty tricks taking place. They used copies of ID cards instead of the cards themselves, and the information from the cards. They falsified some of the records to be able to show that they fulfilled the requirements, and they turned in many more signatures than they needed to. They needed 800,000 and turned in almost 2 million or something like that, a huge amount. But when the electoral authority, the National Electoral Institute, started reviewing these signatures, they started to note inconsistencies when they compared the data, the supposed signature for El Bronco, with the data from the voter rolls.
So if they discovered this, then how do you get on the ballot? What happened in the next step?
They started to fall, but they didn't have real information to back them up, and that's why the National Electoral Institute, with very good reason, denied El Bronco his independent candidacy. because the number of valid signatures he had, the authentic support that he had, didn't meet the minimum requirement. And that's when El Bronco went to the Electoral Tribunal, which is part of Mexico's federal judicial branch, to file a complaint against the National Electoral Institute for denying his bid to be a presidential candidate. And the tribunal, the Electoral Tribunal, decided on a very generous interpretation, to put it mildly, because it was really a terrible attitude in the part of the tribunal. According to their interpretation of the law, the human right to vote and be voted for is more important than faking signatures. And all the irregularities that El Bronco, Jaime Rodríguez Calderón, had been implicated in, they let them slide. And in those circumstances, the tribunal ordered the Electoral Institute to register El Bronco as a candidate, because they said that they had violated his right to a hearing. So here, Laura, this is something that lawyers will understand. If his right to a hearing was violated, which is false, but let's assume that it's true. If his right to a hearing was violated, they should have ordered that he be granted the right to a hearing, and then that his petition be reviewed again. But instead of doing that, the tribunal takes advantage of its jurisdiction and orders the National Electoral Institute to register him.
Well, the argument that people have a right to vote and vote for whom they want is a very strange argument in the case where there's a real question about the validity of the entire process and the signatures themselves. You've also criticized, and this may have something to do with it, the composition of both the tribunal and the institute, the National Electoral Institute. What's happening there? Why is there this danger and evidence that these could be manipulated in political ways?
The normal institutional route is the right way to go. If someone doesn't like what an administrative authority does, they can go to a jurisdictional authority and file a complaint. And that's the right way to do. The problem is that here you can't avoid a reading that the case was politically motivated. And that reading is that the Electoral Tribunal followed a party line for the government and the ruling party. Because the government and its party, the PRI, wanted El Bronco to be on the ballot. And they wanted him to be on the ballot because El Bronco, because of his characteristics, is supposedly going to take votes away from Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So what happened with the tribunal is that it's not just a court that has shown itself to be biased and has practiced favoritism toward the government and its party many times. But in this occasion, there was a divided vote. There were 4 votes in favor of allowing El Bronco to be a candidate and 3 against. So, in practice, if there's a majority, everybody has to go along with the majority decision. And that's what happened. But the process was so bold-faced. The process to get the order to allow El Bronco to be on the ballot, information was leaked that showed that a former legal advisor to the presidency, his name is Castillejos, and he is not a legal advisor anymore, but he still works for the federal government. He was the one who organized the whole process. They even say that the tribunal's ruling was drafted in his office. He did the whole thing. He pressured at least one of the magistrates to attain the majority and get El Bronco on the ballot.
We're back to the criticism, fundamental criticism that you made at the beginning, that you have elections that are intervened in by the state itself, with all the apparatus that a government has in its control for what should be an independent electoral process.
Exactly. And it reflects that. I think it reflects the tribunal's bias. And I think, I've said it a few times before, that the big institutional problem with this election, which is such a transcendental election for Mexico, the big institutional problem is the superior chamber of the electoral tribunal of the federal court, because it's the highest authority on elections. What the superior chamber says goes. So, a superior chamber like this, that has shown itself to be so clearly biased, has clearly shown itself to be a court that toes the line, following the orders of the government and its party, is frankly a danger for democracy and for these elections. Instead of being an institution that guarantees the integrity and the legality of these elections, it's just the opposite. And the case of El Bronco is emblematic, because what it says is that since El Bronco, when he met with the National Electoral Institute, was able to show some voters some support for his candidacy, the tribunal said that if his right to a hearing had to be respected, he will have been able to collect the necessary signatures. But that's completely illogical, because if he had the opportunity to probe himself, and he only proved that around 8% of the signatures were valid, that means that 92% of the signatures couldn't be verified. So the tribunal arrived at this very controversial decision. But also, Laura, in this country, and I guess in every country, but anyway, here the idea of certainty is a fundamental principle for democracy and elections. Certainty. So the tribunal made a ruling based on an assumption that if El Bronco had had more time, he will have, well, that's presumption. What happened to certainty?
Almost a speculation. Well, it certainly is an emblematic case, and precisely of this violation, possible violation of separation of powers and the intervention of interests that are currently in power. Let's look at another case. You have done extensive analysis of the results of the elections in Mexico State, and one of the red flags that you've talked about there, in fact, that there was significant evidence of, is the use of public funds in the elections themselves. Can you tell us what you found in those elections that have a bearing on these presidential elections of 2018?
Let me clarify. We're talking about the elections in the state of Mexico and their relationship with the federal election?
And in particular, the desviación de fondos públicos.
Yes, exactly. The example of what's happening with this electoral process, the clearest precedent is that what happened in the state of Mexico, which is the most populous state of the country, with an even bigger population than Mexico City, which makes sense because a large part of the population of the state of Mexico is the working force for the Mexico City, and it just sleeps in the state of Mexico. That's why the difference makes sense. But well, what happened there is something that after all the many elections I've seen, I have never seen anything like what happened in the state of Mexico in terms of the misuse of public funds. There is a complaint by the Citizens Initiative now. They made a complaint based in the investigation carried out by Polo Diaz, a Mexican legal scholar who has been a fierce critic of OHL, the Spanish company, and his investigation showed how through triangulations, billions of pesos in public funds were funneled to the Alfredo del Mazo campaign. And this is where the weakness of our electoral institutions is revealed, because neither the National Electoral Institute nor the Special Prosecutor for Electoral Crimes nor the Electoral Tribunal, none of them did anything, hardly to stop this, to stop what was happening, which I'm sure you remember, Laura, that the state, not just the government, the Mexican state came out in support of a candidate, Alfredo del Mazo, the PRI candidate. And of course, it was very important to them that Alfredo del Mazo win that election, even by fraudulent means, because, first of all, it's the state where the President Peña Nieto, is from. He's from the state of Mexico. And also, it's a reserve for votes for the PRI. They need to have control of that state. And because it's a rich state, it has a very big budget. And that's why they came out to support him. The misuse of public funds, the use of social programs for political ends, vote buying and voter coercion on a massive scale. Honestly, I don't remember a case where all the human and economic resources of the government had come down so hard to intervene in a state election. And, well, we need to remember the candidate for the PRI, for the coalition that the PRI is leading, José Antonio Meade, went to the state of Mexico and he said, the state of Mexico is an inspiration for my campaign. Of course, it's a message that they're going to do the same thing, and they're doing it.
That it's a model. History has already shown that we, in spite of all the violations, that reported, what was astounding and very disappointing, of course, was the fact that there was so little follow-up. There was so little consequences for that. And I think it's important for the public to understand exactly what you're saying in terms of, we still live in a situation here in Mexico where who controls the government can have a lot of control over how the elections go. And that was one of the major motivations for the dirty elections. I think everybody would have to agree there were very dirty elections that took place in the state of Mexico.
Yes, in our democracy, the presence of the government or governments, especially governments controlled by the PRI, like the current federal government and more or less half of the state governments in Mexico, the presence of those governments in electoral processes is one of the huge unresolved issues of Mexican democracy, because there is a lot of interference through dirty tricks, some of which are illegal, and in this situation we see the weakness of the electoral institutions.
So it's not a problem so much of the laws, excuse me for interrupting, or the regulations, but the way they're being enforced, or do we also need new laws?
I think that the laws are fine as they are. The problem is the application of the laws, that they just aren't enforced. They aren't applied. The law says black, the party says white, and then the authorities go and say gray. When the authorities have to enforce what the law says, they don't always do it. Well, we have to say that the National Electoral Institute, since it's an institution made of many people with different perspectives, sometimes, in some cases, they get to do the right thing. For example, organizing the elections, installing ballot boxes, the election workers who receive the votes, etc. There are no problems with that. All of that gets done relatively well. The problem is that when they need to apply sanctions to the parties of candidates, that's when the electoral authorities show its weaknesses. But in any case, a lot of what the National Electoral Institute does has a high degree of credibility. The big question is how the Electoral Tribunal is going to function in the future. and also what we call the third foot of Mexico's electoral tripod, which is the Special Prosecutor for Electoral Crimes, FEPADE, which has a very unfortunate precedent. When the prosecutor, Santiago Neto Castillo, the head of the Special Prosecutor for Electoral Crimes, started to investigate the Odebrecht case, he was defenestrated, he was fired. And his successor, Héctor Díaz Santana, he may have good intentions, but here, good intentions are not enough. And what's happened is that when Santiago Nieto, the former prosecutor, left the office, well, the issues that he was investigating were stopped there. And also other issues that should be under investigation. For example, there's a large-scale operation to coerce certain strata of society and buy their votes. The Special Prosecutor for Electoral Crimes should be investigating that, because vote buying and voter coercion are electoral crimes. In other words, they're the responsibility of the Special Prosecutor for Electoral Crimes. But do you know about any investigation by the Special Prosecutors that have led to results, that have put people who have committed these crimes of vote buying and voter coercion in jail? Well, there aren't any. So I think that in order for an opposition candidate to win, be it Anaya or Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the candidate will have to win by a landslide. He or she will have to win by such a huge margin over the second place that there is no doubt and nothing can be done to change the result. If it's just a few percentage points, no opposition candidate will be able to win. So that's what we're seeing, and we'll see what happens on election day.
Well, it's a big risk, because, of course, in an electoral system, you shouldn't have a situation. You should have a situation of exactly the kind of certainty you were saying is lacking in the institutions today, so that even if the difference were minimal, the people would be assured that that was the fair reading of the popular vote. And with all these questions surrounding the role of the authorities and what's happened in the past, it looks like we may be going into these elections without having that kind of certainty. So it will certainly be interesting. Is there anything, what can citizens do to help guarantee free and fair elections in this context, do you think?
Well, I think that the power of the Mexican people is facing a big challenge. There is a challenge for the poor to not let themselves be bought, to not accept money to vote for the official candidate. There is a challenge for civil society to really be able to apply pressure and demand that the government and the electoral authorities abide by the law and avoid bias. And I think that's the challenge for Mexican civil society. Fortunately, there are social groups in different parts of the country that are doing it, that are organizing. But the enemy, it's huge, it's a monster. It's like David and Goliath. But let's remember that David, with his sling, was eventually able to defeat Goliath.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge challenge. Eduardo Huchim, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.